And that was where Father went down with a cry, clutching his ankle and rolling over in agony. When he tried to stand, he could not. I went to help him. He looked up. He shook his head. "You take it!" the chief was shouting, and he was shouting at me. "You, Laura, you!" He took me by the shoulders and shook me. "Come on!" So I took up Father's oar and my share of the weight on his shoulder, and leaving Father behind on the dunes, we ran the gig down to the beach and into the sea. We unlashed our oars, leapt in, and at once we were pulling hard for Samson. The waves hurled us up and down so violently that I thought the gig would break her back. I just rowed. As I rowed, I suddenly realised where I was and what I was doing. I was out in the gig. I was rowing out to the wreck. I was doing what I always wanted to do my whole life. At last, at last, at last. No one spoke except the chief. He stood on the prow, bellowing at us. "Row, you beggars, row! Row like hell! There's folk in those water out there! Row your hearts out! Row, blast your eyes! Row!" And I rowed like I'd never rowed before, fixing my eyes on the blade, pulling long and hard through the water, reaching far forward, bracing my feet and digging the oar in again into the sea. The sea churned and surged around the gig. I became my oar became me. I was too busy to feel any fear, too cold to feel any pain. The gig grounded suddenly. I'd not expected it so soon. We were on Samson already. We hung over our oars like wet rags, drained of all of our strength, but the chief hadn't finished with us yet. "Out!" he cried, so we leapt over the side. "We'll carry her across Samson and launch her again on the other side. It's the only way we'll reach them. Come on, you beggars. Be time to rest when it's done." So we tumbled over the side, lashed the oars again, and lifted. The neck of Samson is just 100 yards or so across, but in the teeth of the gale it felt like a mile. More than once I stumbled and fell to my knees, but always there were strong hands grasping me and hauling me to my feet. "I can see them!" cried the chief. "Over on the White Island, I can see them!" The chief was everywhere, lifting us, bellowing behind us, clearing the way ahead of us. We reached the beach on the far side of Samson at last and ran the gig down over the pebbles until the sea took the weight of her from us. We unlashed the oars, pushed her out and piled in. "Pull!" he cried. "Pull for your children, pull for your wives!" I have no children, I have no wife, but I pulled all the same. I pulled instead for Granny May, for Mother, for Father, and for Billy, especially for Billy. It was no great distance across the narrow channel, but the seas were seething. A witch's brew wind and the tide and current took us and tossed us about at will. Under us the gig groaned and cried, but she held together. A thunderous wave reared up above us, and a great green wall of water, and I thought we must go over. "Steady, steady," came the chief's voice, and even the wave seemed to obey him. I felt the boat rise with the wave, surge forward, and then we were surfing in towards the beach, where we were dumped high and safe on the shingle of White Island. I climbed out and looked about me. I saw men staggering towards us. One of them was running ahead of the others. "Laura!" he cried. I knew the voice, and then I knew him. "Billy?" I said, taking his face in my hands to be quite sure. "Is it you, Billy? Is it you?" "Thank God," he whispered. I have to pinch myself still to believe it as I write it. Billy is back. Billy is safe. Billy is home. We hugged out there on White Island. We cried. We laughed. On the way back to Briar, with the wind and the waves behind us and with new strength in our arms, the gig flew over the sea. We had rescued every man on board, and Billy had come home. I could have rowed that gig single-handed. They had hot baths ready for us all over the island. Billy sat there laughing in the tub in the kitchen with us all around him and shivered the cold out of him. He was bigger, stronger, different somehow, but still Billy. We had hot soup, limpets again, but we didn't care, not now. Now I've never seen anyone as hungry. I've never seen Mother glowing so, nor Father so motherly. Everyone's proud of me. I'm proud of me. Billy's too tired to talk much. He says the ship was called Zanzibar. She was bound for New York from France. She was suddenly tired, and Mother took him up to bed. He'll tell us more tomorrow. I've just told Granny May again that Billy's back home, but all she says is the turtle. She's sleeping again now. I'm so tired, and I'm so happy. When I woke up this morning, I thought yesterday must have been a dream. I had to go into Billy's room to make sure it wasn't. He was still asleep. He sleeps like a baby, like he always did, with his fingers alongside his nose. The wind has dropped. From his window I watched the sea dancing in the morning light. Father was on his way out when I got downstairs, leaning on a stick and limping, but beaming at me. "The Zanzibar," he said. "She's still on the rocks, what's left of her, but she won't be there for long. We're going to go see what we can take off." Mother tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. I tried to go with him, but Mother wouldn't have it. She stood between us and the door, took firmly hold of me and sat me down, firmly. Later on, I went up to Sampson Hill with Mother, leaving Billy and Granny May still asleep. Every boat from Briar was out around White Island. The wreck was high on the rocks, only her prow hidden under the water. Her sails were in tatters. The men were crawling all over her like ants. As we watched, we saw the gig pulling away from White Island. She was low in the water. There was laughter across the sea. As the gig came into Rushy Bay below us, I saw something lashed to either side of her. Mother could not make out what it was, and neither could I. The crew had shipped their oars some way from shore and let the gigs come in slowly on their own. Then I saw the chief and old man Jenkins leaning over the side. They had knives in their hands and they were cutting ropes. "Cows," someone said. And at that moment, amid a great splashing and whooping from the gig, 6 cows came out from the sea and came gambolling up the beach. "Well, I'll be beggared," said Mother. The crew leapt out after them, and then began a great cow chase all over Rushy Bay. Father waving his stick at everyone and shouting, and in the end it was difficult to say who was chasing who. We all ran down Sampson Hill to help and drove them up over the dunes to the green, where they settled at last to graze. Father, all breathless, leaned on his stick and shook his head. "Wow," he said, "would you believe it?" But there was a lot more than cows on the wreck of the Zanzibar. All afternoon the boats came back and forth, loaded to the gunwales with timber, with corn, with brandy. Billy was up by now, along with all the other rescued sailors from the Zanzibar. He lent a hand. By evening, the beach on Rushy Bay was littered with piles of loot. Every family had their own pile, and we ferried it back home in the donkey carts. We had prayed for a wreck, and a wreck had come. And what a wreck! That a miracle had happened, no one doubts. There is wood enough to rebuild our battered houses, to rebuild and replace our ruined boats. There are cows to give us milk, and all the corn we need to feed us, and them through winter. And there'll be enough to cover us for seed next spring, and brandy enough, Father says, to keep us happy forever. Granny May insisted that we get her up. She keeps touching Billy to make sure he's real. She took some soup, the first time she's eaten for days, and then made us take her back to Rushy Bay to see the wreck. She couldn't walk, so Billy and his friends from the Zanzibar pulled her across the island in the back of the cart, as the donkeys were still busy. She was beside me this evening at high tide, when we heard the Zanzibar groan. Everyone was there to watch her go. We watched her sink slowly into the sea, her shredded sails whipping into the wind, waving at us. I waved back in silence. The crew took off their hats, some crossed themselves, and one of them fell onto his knees in the sand and thanked God. And then we all knelt with him, except Granny May, I noticed. We're staying. Everyone's staying. Billy's staying. He said so. He promised. He crossed his heart and hoped to die. He's been all over the world. America, Ireland, France, Spain, Africa even. Imagine that, Africa. I asked him about Joseph Hannibal. It seems he didn't quite turn out to be as Billy expected. He drank a lot. He borrowed Billy's money, and then he never gave it back. And then when Billy asked for it, he threatened him. So Billy left the General Lee in New York and became a cabin boy on the Zanzibar. And it was the Zanzibar that had taken him all over the world. Billy says there's beautiful places in the world, wonders you wouldn't believe unless you saw them with your own eyes. And that there's nowhere else in the world quite like Scilly, nowhere else like home. I told him I knew that already, and Father said there's some things you've got to find out for yourself, and Billy, and he smiled at each other.